The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room, cutting through the silence like a rhythmic heartbeat. It was well past midnight, the time when the world usually feels heavy and still, but inside this small bedroom. The air was thick with a kind of tension that doesn't just fade away with the setting sun. Elias sat on the edge of the mattress, his body slumped forward in a way that showed just how exhausted he really was. The mattress was soft, worn in from years of use, and the old springs gave a tiny squeak every time he shifted his weight. He tried to stay still, though, because moving too much might break the fragile calm that had finally settled over the room. For 14 straight nights, this had been the routine. This wasn't a normal bedtime story situation. There were no playful giggles or requests for just one more glass of water. Instead, there was a battle. It was a silent, invisible war against fear, and 6-year-old Maya was fighting it with everything she had. She lay under the quilt, her small body looking even tinier amongst the pillows, but her eyes were wide open. They were fixed on the ceiling, staring at the shadows cast by the lamp on the nightstand. She wasn't looking at anything specific. She was just watching, waiting. It was as if she believed that the moment she closed her eyes, the safety of the room would vanish, and she would be back in the chaos she had come from. Elias looked down at her, his heart aching in a way that made his chest feel physically tight. He was a big man, with rough hands and a face that had seen a lot of life, but looking at this little girl made him feel helpless. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering near her arm, wanting to offer comfort but terrified of scaring her. In the 2 weeks she had been with him as an emergency foster placement, she had flinched every time he moved too fast. She didn't trust him yet, and he couldn't blame her. Trust is something that takes time to build, especially when it has been broken so many times before. The room itself was simple. There were no heavy, threatening doors to lock out the world, just a light curtain swaying slightly over the open closet. The window was open a crack, letting in the cool night air, but the weather outside was calm. There was no storm, no rain hammering against the glass to add drama to the moment. Just the quiet, distant hum of a car driving down the street somewhere far away. It was a normal night in a normal neighborhood, but for Maya, normalcy felt strange and new. "Are you comfortable?" Elias whispered, his voice raspy from reading for so long. Maya didn't answer. She just blinked, her long lashes brushing against her cheeks for a brief second before her eyes snapped open again. She pulled the quilt up higher, tucking it under her chin. Her knuckles were white from gripping the fabric so tightly. It was her shield. If she was covered, she felt hidden. If she was hidden, maybe she was safe. Elias sighed softly and picked up the book again. It was a children's story about a bear who couldn't find his honey pot. He had read it every single night since she arrived. He knew the words by heart now. He didn't need to look at the pages, but he kept the book open anyway, turning the pages slowly because the routine seemed to give her a small sense of structure. He started reading, his voice low and steady, trying to match the rhythm of a lullaby. "The bear looked left," Elias read softly, "and the bear looked right." He watched her face as he spoke. Her eyes were still open, darting around the room, tracking the corners where the shadows gathered. She was looking for threats that weren't there. It broke his heart to see a child so young carrying such a heavy load of worry. Kids her age should be worried about what toy to play with next, not about whether they are safe to close their eyes. He remembered the social worker telling him bits and pieces of her story, enough to make him understand why she was so guarded. She had learned the hard way that sleep made you vulnerable. She had learned that bad things often happen when the lights go out. But Elias was determined. He was stubborn in a quiet way. He wanted to show her that this house was different. Here, the night didn't bring monsters. It brought soft blankets, warm milk, and a voice that would stay with her until she drifted off. He kept reading paragraph after paragraph, his voice never wavering. The story was silly and simple, but the tone was what mattered. It was a sound that said, "I am here. I am not leaving." "You can rest." As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the room began to shift very slowly. Maya's breathing, which had been shallow and quick, started to deepen. Her grip on the quilt loosened just a fraction. The frantic energy that usually buzzed around her like an electric current began to fade, replaced by a heavy drowsiness that she could no longer fight. She tried to keep her eyes open one last time, her eyelids fluttering like butterfly wings, but gravity was winning. Elias noticed the change immediately. He stopped reading but didn't close the book. He just watched her. He saw her head tilt slightly to the side, sinking deeper into the pillow. The tension in her small shoulders finally dropped away. Her hand, which had been clutching the blanket so tight her fingers hurt, relaxed until it was just resting gently on the fabric. For a long moment, Elias didn't move. He barely breathed. He was scared that if he made a sound, the spell would break, and she would snap back into that state of hyper-alertness. But she didn't. Her breathing became a soft, rhythmic inhale and exhale that was the sweetest sound he had heard in weeks. She was finally asleep. It looked peaceful, but to Elias it looked like a victory. It was a small victory in a very big war, but it mattered. He leaned back slightly, stretching his back which had become stiff from sitting in the same position for so long. The lamp on the nightstand cast a warm, yellow glow over her face, smoothing out the worry lines that were usually there when she was awake. She looked so young in that light, just a little girl in a too-big world. He looked around the room, feeling a mix of emotions. There was relief, of course. There was also a profound sadness that a 6-year-old had to try this hard just to get some rest. But mostly, there was a fierce, growing sense of love and protection. He looked at the open doorway leading to the hallway, thinking about his own empty bed in the other room. He was tired, bone-tired, but he couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. He wanted to memorize this moment, the quiet, the peace, the way her chest rose and fell. He thought about the list of things the social worker had told him to do. Establish a routine. Create a safe space. Be patient. He had tried to do all of that, but standing there watching her sleep, he realized it wasn't about a checklist. It was about time. It was about showing up, night after night, even when it was hard. Elias carefully closed the book, the pages making a soft asterisk thump that sounded loud in the quiet room. He winced, looking down at Maya. She didn't stir. She was too deep in sleep now, lost in a dream that he hoped was happy. He hoped she was dreaming about fields of flowers or flying kites, anything but the past. He reached out, his hand trembling just a little, and gently brushed a stray curl away from her forehead. Her skin was warm, and she leaned into his touch slightly, even in her sleep. That small movement hit him harder than anything else. It was a sign of trust. Unconscious, maybe, but it was there. She trusted that his hand wouldn't hurt her. He pulled the blanket up one more time, tucking the edges around her small body like a cocoon. The apartment was quiet, safe, and warm. The battles of the day were over, and for tonight she had won. She had found her way to sleep, and he had been there to see it. As he prepared to stand up, feeling the stiffness in his legs, he took one last look at her peaceful face, knowing that the hardest part of the night was over, but the journey ahead was still long. He let out a long, slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. She was safe. For tonight, that was enough. The room was perfectly still now. The only sound that broke the silence was the soft, rhythmic breathing coming from the bed. It was a sound that Elias had been waiting to hear for what felt like a lifetime. For days, the nights had been filled with crying, pacing, and whispered fears, but tonight, the air was clear. He sat there for a long time just listening. He didn't want to move too quickly. It felt like if he stood up too fast, the magic of the moment would shatter like thin glass. He needed to let the peace settle in, to make sure it was real and not just a trick of his tired mind. Elias looked down at his hands. They were rough and calloused, the hands of a man who had worked hard his entire life. But resting near Maya's small, pale hand, they looked gentle. He realized how much tension he had been holding in his own body. His neck was stiff, and his back ached from sitting in the same awkward position for over an hour. Slowly, carefully, he began to unknot his muscles. He rolled his shoulders back, feeling the joints pop softly in the quiet room. It was a relief, but he winced at every small sound his body made, terrified that the noise would wake her up. He waited a few seconds, watching her face closely. Maya didn't move. She was deep in the land of dreams now, her chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm that was comforting to watch. Seeing her like this made Elias feel a warm sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a big thing getting a child to sleep. Parents did it every night all over the world without a second thought. But for them, this was a massive victory. It was the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. With a final, gentle look, Elias decided it was time to leave. He needed to let her rest properly. His presence, even though he meant it to be comforting, might still be a source of alertness for her on some subconscious level. If she woke up and saw him there, she might feel the need to be good or to follow the rules she had made for herself. He wanted her to just sleep, to be free from expectation for a few hours. He shifted his weight, preparing to stand up. The old mattress gave a low, groaning squeak as his weight lifted. Elias froze, his heart jumping in his chest. He held his breath, his eyes locked on Maya's face. Her eyelids fluttered for a second, and she let out a small sigh, turning her head to the side. Elias didn't move a muscle. He waited, counting the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3. She settled back into her deep breathing, her face relaxing again. He let out his own breath, realizing he had been holding it until his lungs burned. He stood up fully now, his legs feeling a bit wobbly from sitting still for so long. He stretched his back, trying to work out the kinks without making too much noise. He felt old in that moment, the weight of his years pressing down on him. Foster caring wasn't a young man's game. It took patience, a kind of slow, enduring patience that comes with age and experience. He looked around the small room, taking in the details. The stack of colorful books on the shelf, the small desk with a few crayons scattered on it, the nightlight shaped like a star that cast a soft glow on the wall. It was a good room, a safe room. Elias turned toward the doorway. The entrance was open wide, framing the dark hallway beyond. There were no heavy doors to close and lock, no barriers to separate them from the rest of the house. He liked it that way. He wanted her to know she wasn't locked in, that she was part of the home now. He stepped carefully, placing his feet on the parts of the floorboard he knew wouldn't creak. He had lived in this apartment for decades, and he knew exactly which steps made noise. He moved like a ghost, silent and smooth. As he crossed the threshold, he felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a profound sense of relief that the night was finally over, but there was also a lingering sadness. He looked back one last time over his shoulder. Maya looked so small in the big bed. The quilt was pulled up to her chin, and her hair was spread out like a dark halo on the white pillowcase. She looked peaceful, yes, but she also looked incredibly fragile. It reminded him of a bird that had fallen out of a nest, finally healed enough to sleep but still not ready to fly. He thought about the kitchen waiting for him. There were dishes in the sink from dinner, soup and crackers, simple food that she had actually managed to eat. He needed to wash them. He needed to make himself a cup of tea, maybe sit in his armchair and stare at the television for a while before he could even think about sleeping himself. The routine of the night called to him. It was the familiar, boring stuff of life that kept him grounded. Elias took another step into the hallway. The air out here was cooler, away from the warmth of the bedside lamp. The shadows were longer out here, dancing against the walls as the light from the street outside filtered through the blinds. He felt a sudden wave of loneliness hit him. The house felt big and empty when he was the only one awake in it. For years, it had just been him and his silence. Now, having Maya here, even with all the difficulties and the sleepless nights, made the silence feel heavier when she was asleep. It made him realize how much he had gotten used to her presence in just 2 weeks. He leaned against the doorframe for a moment, rubbing his face with his hands. He was tired down to his bones. But it was a good kind of tired. It was the tiredness of having done something worthwhile. He thought about tomorrow. He thought about making her pancakes, maybe trying to get her to smile again. He thought about the long road ahead, the therapy sessions, the school meetings, the slow process of building a life together. It seemed daunting, an impossible mountain to climb. But then he thought about her breathing, soft and steady, and he knew he would climb it. He would do whatever it took. He pushed himself off the frame and took one more step away from the room. He was almost out. He was ready to leave her to her dreams. He was ready to go back to being just Elias, the man who lived alone, instead of Elias, the foster father, the guardian, the protector. He needed that hour of solitude to recharge, to be ready for whatever tomorrow brought. But just as he was about to turn his back completely and walk down the hall toward the kitchen, a tiny sound stopped him. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a call for help. It was just the rustle of fabric. Elias paused, his foot hovering in midair. He turned his head slightly, listening. The room was quiet again. He assumed she was just adjusting her position, finding a comfier spot in the deep stages of sleep. He shook his head slightly, smiling a tired smile to himself. He was being too jumpy. She was fine. She was finally fine. He took his eyes off her and focused on the hallway ahead. The shadows seemed to stretch out, inviting him into the quiet rest of the house. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the old apartment, dust, lemon polish, and the faint smell of the soup from earlier. He felt a sense of closure for the night. The battle was won. The retreat was successful. He had done his job. He had sat with her, read to her, and waited with her until the fear went away. Now he could grant her the dignity of sleeping alone. He could respect her space. That was important, too. She needed to know that he wasn't hovering over her every second, that she had her own territory. Elias took another step, his socked foot making no sound on the rug. He was mentally listing the things he needed to do in the kitchen: turn on the kettle, wash the bowl, wipe the table, simple tasks. Mindless tasks, exactly what his tired brain needed. He felt his shoulders drop another inch as the tension of the vigil slowly left his body. He was at the point of no return now. If he took 2 more steps, he would be fully in the hallway, and the light from the room wouldn't reach him anymore. He would be in the dark. He looked at the floor, thinking about his own bed. His own mattress wasn't as soft as the one in the guest room, but it was his. He wondered if he would be able to sleep, or if he would just lie there staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds that weren't there. He let out a soft chuckle at his own paranoia. He was acting like a new parent with a newborn. He remembered his neighbors telling him stories about checking on their kids 10 times a night just to see if they were breathing. He understood that feeling now. It wasn't about logic, it was about love. Even this early, even with the walls she had put up, he cared for her deeply. He cared enough to stand in a dark hallway at 1 in the morning, debating whether to leave or stay 1 minute longer. He decided to leave. He had to. Staying would be creepy. Staying would wake her up. He turned his body fully toward the kitchen now. He was committed to the retreat. He was going to walk away, have his tea, and let the night take its course. But just as he shifted his weight to take that final step out of the room, a movement in his peripheral vision caught his eye. It was subtle, just a shift in the light. It wasn't Maya waking up. It was something small, something barely noticeable happening on the bed. He didn't want to look, he wanted to keep walking. He wanted to believe that everything was perfect and that he could just go and relax. But curiosity, mixed with that instinctual protectiveness, made him stop. He froze mid-step. He turned his head slowly back toward the bed. The light from the lamp was still glowing, illuminating the scene. Maya was still asleep, her face peaceful, but something had changed. The blanket had moved, and where the blanket had shifted, something else was visible, something that shouldn't have been there, something that made the hair on the back of Elias' neck stand up. He stood there, 1 foot in the hallway and 1 foot still in the room, staring at the bed, the feeling of relief instantly replaced by a cold knot of confusion. He wasn't leaving yet. Not until he figured out what he was seeing. Elias stood frozen in the open doorway, 1 foot lingering in the bedroom and the other hovering over the threshold of the hall. The quiet of the apartment wrapped around him like a thick blanket, but inside his chest, his heart was beating a little faster than normal. He had been so close to leaving, so close to stepping away and giving her the space she needed. But now, his eyes were locked on the bed, drawn by a small movement that seemed to shout in the silence. Maya's hand, which had been resting so gently on the pillow, twitched. It was a sharp, sudden movement, like a reflex. Elias watched, his breath caught in his throat, wondering if she was waking up. Maybe the nightmare had found her even in her sleep, but her eyes stayed closed. Her breathing remained that slow, steady rhythm that he had waited so long to hear. She wasn't waking up. She was just moving, chasing a dream or perhaps running away from one. Her small fingers curled tightly, grabbing a fistful of the white pillowcase. She pulled at it, dragging the fabric downward toward her chin. It was a clinging motion, the kind a scared child makes when they are holding onto a safety net. As the pillowcase slid down with her grip, something that had been hidden underneath the edge of the pillow was dislodged. It wasn't a toy. It wasn't a stuffed animal. It was a piece of paper. Gravity took over. The white square slipped silently from the hiding spot and drifted through the air. It seemed to take forever to fall, floating gently in the warm light of the lamp. It landed softly on the carpet, right in the small space between the bed and the nightstand. It was barely visible in the shadows, but Elias saw it. To him, it looked like a bright white flag of surrender lying on the floor. Elias felt a sudden, tight knot form in his stomach. He knew he should just walk away. He knew that a child's privacy is sacred, especially for a child who has had so little control over her own life. She had tucked that paper there for a reason. She had hidden it under her pillow right next to her head, which meant it was important to her. It was probably a treasure, a drawing she made, or maybe a secret note. He told himself to turn around. Just go to the kitchen, Elia's asterisk, he thought. Wash the dishes, make the tea, leave her be, but his feet wouldn't move. He stood there staring at the white shape on the floor. His mind started to race with a father's worry. What if it wasn't a drawing? What if it was something dangerous? What if she had written something that meant she was hurting herself? What if she was planning to run away? The fear was cold and sharp. In his line of work in the life of a foster parent, you learn that secrets can sometimes be dangerous. You learn that the things kids hide are often the things they need help with the most. He looked back at Maya's sleeping face. She looked so innocent, her mouth slightly open, her breathing peaceful. She had no idea that her secret had tumbled out into the open. Elias felt a pang of guilt. If he picked up that paper, he would be invading her trust. He would be crossing a line. But if he didn't and something was wrong, he would never forgive himself. The conflict tore at him. He rubbed his face with his hand, sighing deeply. The silence of the room felt heavy now, pressing down on his ears. He looked at the open doorway, tempting him to leave, and then back at the paper. "Just a look," he whispered to the empty room. His voice sounded shaky. "Just to make sure she's safe." It was a justification, and he knew it, but it was the only way he could live with himself. Elias slowly pulled his foot back from the hallway. He turned his whole body toward the bed again. He moved like he was walking on thin ice, placing each foot down with extreme care. He didn't want the floorboards to creak. He didn't want to disturb the air in the room. He felt like an intruder in his own guest room, sneaking around a sleeping child. It felt wrong, yet the pull to know the truth was stronger than his guilt. He inched closer to the side of the bed. The lamp on the nightstand cast a pool of yellow light, but the paper had landed just outside that circle in the gray shadow. Elias squinted, trying to make out the shape of it. It was crumpled, folded over multiple times. It looked like it had been handled a lot, smoothed out and crumpled up again, maybe in moments of anxiety. He reached the edge of the bed. He was standing right over Maya now. He looked down at her, checking her breathing one more time. She was still deeply asleep, lost in a world that he hoped was kinder than the one she woke up in. She didn't stir as he leaned over. Elias' knees popped as he lowered himself into a crouch. He ignored the stiffness in his joints. His focus was entirely on the floor. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly. The distance between his hand and the paper seemed to shrink in slow motion. As his fingers brushed the paper, he noticed the texture. It wasn't plain white paper from a printer. It was thicker, with rough edges along one side. It looked like a page that had been torn out of a spiral notebook, the kind of notebook kids use in school. This detail made his heart sink even further. It was schoolwork, a homework assignment, or a letter she was writing and couldn't finish. He pinched the corner of the paper between his thumb and forefinger. He lifted it slowly off the carpet. As it rose, it caught the light from the lamp. Elias could see that the paper was covered in writing. It wasn't a drawing. There were no colorful crayon marks or flowers. It was dense, messy writing. He turned the paper over in his hands. It was warm, having been pressed against the pillow and her head all night. It felt fragile. He held it gently, afraid that if he held it too tight, it might disintegrate. He unfolded the first crease, being incredibly quiet. The paper made a soft, crisp sound as the crease flattened out. It wasn't loud, but to Elias, in the dead silence of the room, it sounded like a crack of thunder. He froze, his eyes darting to Maya's face. She shifted slightly, letting out a small, sleepy murmur. Elias held his breath, his muscles locked tight. He waited, terrified that she would open her eyes and catch him in the act of betrayal. But after a long second, she settled back down, her breathing returning to its deep rhythm. Elias let out the breath he was holding. It came out as a shaky whisper. He looked back down at the paper in his hands. He had to know. He had to see what was written on it. He unfolded the rest of the paper, smoothing it out against his knee. The handwriting was unmistakably a child S. The letters were big and uneven, some slanting to the left and some to the right. Some were pressed hard into the paper, the lead dark and angry, while others were light and shaky. It looked like it had been written in a hurry or perhaps with great emotion. The pencil lines were smudged in places, as if tears had fallen on the page or a sweaty hand had rubbed over it. Elias brought the paper closer to his face, narrowing his eyes to decipher the messy scrawl in the dim light. He prepared himself for anything. He thought he might see "I hate you" or "I want to go home." He thought he might see a list of demands or angry words. But as his eyes focused on the first line, he realized it wasn't a letter to anyone. It was a list. The words were written in a column, numbered 1, 2, 3 down the page. The sight of it sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He was holding something personal, something raw. He was holding a window into Maya's soul that she had kept tightly shut until now. He sat there on the floor, his back against the bed frame, holding the piece of torn notebook paper. He was no longer just a tired man trying to get to the kitchen. He was a guardian staring into the dark heart of a child's fear. He didn't know it yet, but the words he was about to read were going to change everything. He unfolded the last crease, flattening the paper out completely, and began to read. The silence of the room suddenly felt very loud, waiting for him to understand the secret she had been hiding under her pillow. Elias held the crumpled paper steady, his eyes scanning the messy scribbles in the dim light. The lamp on the nightstand buzzed very quietly, a sound that was usually annoying but now seemed to match the humming tension in his own head. He looked at the first line on the paper, and the words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. It was written in heavy, dark strokes, as if the child had pressed down with all her strength to make sure the letters stayed on the page. The first rule was simple. 1. Be quiet. Elias stared at those 2 words. He thought back over the last 2 weeks. Maya had barely made a sound since she arrived. She walked on her toes, she closed doors softly, and she never shouted. At first, Elias had thought she was just shy or maybe naturally polite. He had told himself she was a quiet kid, a thinker. But looking at the rule now, written in her own handwriting, he understood the terrifying truth. She wasn't trying to be polite, she was trying to survive. In her past world, being loud meant getting into trouble. Being loud meant pain. She had learned that silence was the only way to stay safe. Elias felt a lump form in his throat, thick and hard. He realized that every time she sat silently at the dinner table, she wasn't just eating, she was following a lifeline rule. His eyes moved down to the second line. The handwriting here was a bit shakier, as if her hand had been trembling when she wrote it. 2, don't ask for food. Elias let out a sharp breath, the sound harsh in the quiet room. He remembered the night before when he had offered her a second helping of spaghetti. Her eyes had gone wide, filled with panic, and she had shaken her head rapidly. She had said she was full, but her stomach had growled loudly a few minutes later. He had assumed she just wasn't used to the food, or maybe she had a stomach ache. He had even teased her gently about not having a big appetite. Now the guilt of that tease washed over him, hot and stinging. She wasn't not hungry. She was terrified to ask. The rule was burned into her mind. Asking for food was dangerous. It meant you were greedy. It meant you were a burden. Elias looked at the small girl sleeping peacefully, unaware that her secret hunger had been revealed. He felt sick thinking about how many times she might have gone to bed hungry in the past, too scared to voice the most basic need of a child. He had to pause for a moment, wiping a hand roughly over his eyes. The paper was shaking in his grip, but he forced himself to keep reading. He needed to know it all. He needed to see the full map of her fear. The third line was shorter, but somehow more heartbreaking. 3. Don't cry when it's dark. Elias looked up at the ceiling, trying to blink away the moisture blurring his vision. This explained the nighttime battles. It explained why she fought sleep with such desperate energy. It wasn't just nightmares she was afraid of, it was the act of crying itself. She had been conditioned to believe that showing weakness, especially at night when no one could see, was forbidden. Tears were a punishment waiting to happen. Elias thought about all the times he had checked on her, finding her staring into the dark with wide, dry eyes. She wasn't brave in the way he thought. She was suppressing a natural human reaction because she was terrified of the consequences. She was forcing herself to be stone, to be hard, just to get through the night. It was a weight no 6-year-old should ever have to carry. He looked back down at the paper. The fourth line was written in a lighter pencil, as if she had written it quickly, wanting to get it over with. 4. Always say thank you so they don't get mad. This one made a small, sad sound escape Elia's lips. "Oh, Maya," he whispered. He remembered how she thanked him for everything. She thanked him for the toast. She thanked him for the toothbrush. She thanked him for the clean socks. He had thought she was just being raised well. He had prided himself on having such a polite foster child. Now he saw the manipulation behind it. It wasn't gratitude, it was a defense mechanism. She was saying the magic words to keep the anger away. In her mind, thank you was a shield. If she said it enough times, maybe the yelling wouldn't start. Maybe the hands wouldn't hit. It broke his heart to think that her kindness was actually born out of fear. Every thank you was a plea for safety. Finally, his eyes reached the last line on the list. It was at the very bottom of the page, written in small, cramped letters that were almost squeezed together. 5. Be invisible. Elia stared at this rule for a long time. Be invisible. This was the core of it all. This was the lesson she had learned best. If you don't take up space, if you don't have needs, if you don't make a sound, then you can't be a target. She was trying to disappear. She was trying to erase herself from the world just to avoid getting hurt. Elias looked at her small form under the blanket. She was so tiny already, but she was trying to make herself even smaller. He thought about how she would press herself against the wall when he walked by, how she would sit in the corner of the couch. It wasn't shyness. It was an attempt to vanish. Below the list, drawn in a clumsy circle with 2 dots for eyes and a curved line for a mouth, was a small face. But the line of the mouth wasn't smiling. It was turned downward in a deep, heavy frown. It was a picture of how she felt inside. It was a picture of the little girl who had to follow these rules just to make it through the day. Elias carefully folded the paper, his hands trembling so much that he could barely make the creases straight. The silence in the room felt different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it was heavy with the truth. He felt a surge of anger, not at Maya, but at the faceless people who had taught her these lessons. He was angry at a world that let a child believe she had to earn the right to exist. He wanted to shout, to punch the wall, to let out the frustration building up inside him. But he didn't. He couldn't, not here, not next to her. Instead, he just sat there on the hard floor, his back against the bed frame, and let the tears come. They didn't fall silently. They came in ragged gasps that he muffled with his own hand. He cried for the little girl who thought she had to be invisible. He cried for the thank yous that were really cries for help. He cried for the meals she was too scared to ask for. The realization washed over him like a cold wave. She wasn't a problem child or a difficult case. She was a survivor. She was doing exactly what she had been trained to do. She was following her rules perfectly, and in doing so, she was slowly disappearing. Elias looked at the paper one last time before he had to put it back. The words seemed to burn into his retinas. He knew now what his job was. It wasn't just to feed her or clothe her. It was to help her break these rules. It was to teach her that she could be loud, that she could be hungry, that she could cry, and that she would still be safe. He needed to teach her that she didn't need to be invisible to be loved. In fact, he wanted her to be visible. He wanted to see her, all of her, the happy and the sad. He wiped his face on his sleeve, trying to compose himself. He had to put the note back. He couldn't let her know he had seen it yet. If she knew he had read her secret rules, she might only make more rules. She might retreat even further. No, he had to play this carefully. He had to be the steady force she needed, slowly dismantling the wall one brick at a time. With a heavy heart but a newfound sense of purpose, Elias leaned over the edge of the mattress. He slid the paper back underneath the pillow, exactly where he had found it. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the pillowcase, feeling the warmth of her head through the fabric. He knew the road ahead would be long. He knew there would be setbacks. But as he looked at her sleeping face, he made a silent vow. He would spend every day proving to her that the paper under her pillow was wrong. He would replace those rules with new ones. You are allowed to be heard. You are allowed to eat. You are allowed to cry, and most importantly, you are allowed to be seen. He sat back on his heels, taking a deep, shaky breath. The tears had stopped, but the ache in his chest remained. It was a different kind of ache now, not one of helplessness, but one of resolve. He wasn't just a foster father anymore. He was a guardian of her spirit, and he was ready to fight for her. Elias kept his hand resting on the pillow for a moment longer, feeling the soft fabric beneath his palm. The secret note was hidden again, tucked away in the darkness where Maya thought it was safe. But for Elias, the darkness had been lifted. He knew the truth now. The silence of the room, which had felt so peaceful just 10 minutes ago, now felt incredibly heavy. It was the kind of heavy silence that you feel when you walk into an empty church or stand in front of a grave. It was sacred and sad all at once. He slowly pulled his hand back, but he didn't stand up. His legs felt weak, like jelly, as if all the strength had drained right out of them. Instead of walking to the kitchen like he had planned, he slid down. He lowered himself onto the floor, resting his back against the side of the mattress. The carpet was rough against his hands, and the floor was hard, but he didn't care. He needed to be close to her. He needed to be on her level. For a long time, he just sat there, staring at the wall across the room. He saw the light fixture, the shape of the window, and the stack of books, but he wasn't really seeing them. His mind was playing a movie of the last 2 weeks, but now the movie was in color, not black and white. He saw Maya sitting at the table, not just being quiet, but terrified to speak. He saw her refusing a second cookie, not because she wasn't hungry, but because rule number 2 was screaming in her head. He saw her saying, "Thank you," 50 times a day, not out of joy, but out of fear. The realization hit him like a wave crashing over a rock. This is what broke him. It wasn't just the sadness of a bad situation, it was the unfairness of it. This little girl had spent 6 years on Earth learning how to disappear. She had spent 6 years thinking that her needs didn't matter, that her voice didn't matter, that she didn't matter. And here she was, sleeping in his guest room, still following those rules perfectly because she thought she had to. Elias felt a hot stinging in his eyes, and this time he didn't try to wipe it away. He didn't try to be the tough, stoic man. He let the tears come. They started slowly rolling down his rough cheeks and dripping onto his shirt. Then they came faster. His chest began to shake with silent sobs. He pressed his fist against his mouth to keep from making any noise. He didn't want to wake her. He couldn't let her see him like this. She would think she had done something wrong to make him cry. She would think she had broken a rule. So he cried in the dark, alone on the floor. He cried for the little girl she used to be, the one who learned to be invisible. He cried for the loneliness she must have felt when she was hungry and too scared to ask. He cried for the tears she was too scared to shed at night. It was a deep, gut-wrenching cry that cleansed the soul. It was the sound of a heart breaking so that it could grow bigger. As he wept, he looked up at the bottom of the mattress. He could see the outline of Maya's small body through the blankets. She was right there, just inches away from him, but in so many ways, she was miles away. She was living in a world of fear that he couldn't see, a world with strict rules and harsh punishments. His job wasn't just to give her a bed. It was to dismantle that world, brick by brick, and build a new one where she could run and shout and eat and laugh. The tears eventually slowed down, leaving him feeling drained but strangely clear-headed. His head throbbed a little, and his eyes felt puffy and sore, but the knot in his chest had loosened. He took a deep, shaky breath and wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt. He looked at his hands again, big, rough, capable hands. He thought about what those hands could do. They could cook her a big breakfast tomorrow morning. They could draw pictures with her. They could hold her when she finally let herself cry. He realized then that he couldn't just pretend he didn't see the note. He couldn't go back to being just a caretaker. He had to be a warrior for her. The war wasn't fought with guns or shouting. It was fought with patience. It was fought with pancakes on a Tuesday morning. It was fought with telling her it was okay to be loud. It was a slow war, a quiet war, but he was ready to fight it. Elias leaned his head back against the mattress, listening to her breathe, in and out, in and out. It was the most beautiful sound in the world to him now. Every breath was a victory. Every moment she slept peacefully was a step away from her past. He thought about the morning. He knew she would wake up and put her mask back on. She would be quiet. She would follow her rules. But things would be different for him. When she whispered, "Thank you," he wouldn't just hear politeness. He would hear her fear, and he would answer with extra love. When she sat silently, he would gently invite her into the conversation. He would break the rules for her. He would be loud enough for both of them until she found her own voice. The night was wearing on. The street outside was completely silent now. The city was sleeping, just like Maya. Elias felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, but it was a good exhaustion. It was the feeling of a burden shared. He wasn't carrying her past anymore. She was letting him see it, and that was the start of healing. He shifted his legs, trying to get comfortable on the hard floor. He knew he should get up and go to his own bed. He knew his back would hurt in the morning if he slept here, but he couldn't leave, not yet. He wanted to be the first thing she saw if she woke up scared. He wanted to be a wall between her and her fears, so he stayed there. He curled his arms around his knees and rested his chin on his arms, watching over her like a guardian at a gate. He made a silent promise to the empty room and to the sleeping girl. He promised that she would never have to be invisible again. He promised that she would never have to earn her food. He promised that she could cry as much as she wanted, and he would just hold her until the tears stopped. The lamp on the nightstand was still on, casting a warm, golden glow over the scene. It wasn't a scary darkness anymore. It was a warm, protective light. Elias looked at Maya's face one more time. She looked so young, so fragile, but she was strong. She had survived this long by following her rules. Now she had to learn how to live by breaking them. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, just to rest them, listening to the rhythm of the house. The refrigerator hummed in the distance. The wind whispered against the window, and right next to him a little girl breathed. This was what life was about, he realized. It wasn't about the big successes or the money or the things you own. It was about this. It was about sitting on a cold floor in the middle of the night, heartbroken and hopeful all at the same time, loving someone who was too scared to love themselves back. It was messy and it was painful, but it was real. He opened his eyes again, determined to stay awake. He would be his rock, he would be her safe place. The note had broken his heart, yes, but in breaking it, it had opened up space for something bigger. It had opened up space for a father's love. And as he sat there in the quiet, watching over the girl who tried so hard to be invisible, he knew that he would never let her fade away again. She was seen, she was heard, and she was home.